delighted to welcome you back as you continue your studies of the Greek of the New Testament. As you know, this time we're coming to chapter 25 in Machen's text. Chapter 25, which means, the end is in sight, so you're doing well and keep up the good work. We only have 8 more chapters after this chapter, and you'll be through this textbook and well on your way to reading the New Testament in its original language. So congratulations on your progress. This particular chapter is interesting. There's really no new concepts in this chapter, so I suppose that's the good news. The bad news is that you do learn that there are some very important words in the vocabulary of the New Testament that seem to be a little bit odd in the way that they are declined. These are all words that are associated with the third declension. We learned the third declension, of course, back in chapter 17 in anticipation of our studies of participles. But now we're learning that there's a little bit more to this third declension than Machen let on when we were back in chapter 17. And these are simply some other words which are part of the third declension but are somewhat irregular, I'll say. They are regular in and of themselves, but there's several different kinds of third declension nouns that are declined somewhat differently. I don't know what else to say about it than that. I think the best approach to this chapter is just going to be to dive in. I want to go through the vocabulary list once again, as we typically do, and then I want to show you each of these separate classes of third declension nouns. The most important thing for you to bear in mind is simply this. This is not a chapter to be passed over lightly. I think, at least in my experience, some beginning Greek students look at this and realize there's no new grammatical information here, and it appears to just be a few more vocabulary words that need to be mastered, and they tend to not give it as much attention as it deserves. But I simply want to sort of reinforce to you that these words are highly important in the New Testament. These are words that show up very frequently. In fact, I think it's safe to say that you could just flip open the Greek New Testament to any page at random, and you would find one or more of these nouns showing up. They're so ubiquitous and so constantly used that these are really words that you want to master. And so pay special attention to this. It's not difficult. It simply boils down really to just applying your memorization skills and learning a few new endings for these different words. And so that's really what you'll need to do for this chapter. But beyond that, I don't think you're going to find any great challenges here at all. So as I say, let's just go ahead and get started. We'll look at the vocabulary list, and then we'll look at each of these paradigms that concerns the various declensions. And then, as is our custom, we'll do the first 3 of each of the exercises that are provided by Machen, and then I'll turn you loose to work on the rest on your own. So great to have you along. Let's go ahead and take a look at these vocabulary words. The first of the vocabulary words that is before us here is actually not a noun but an adjective. It's the word alethes, and you'll notice the separate ending here, alethes. This is actually being reserved by Machen until this chapter because it also is a third declension adjective. I think you know from your prior studies that generally adjectives are declined according to the first and second declensions, but this is one in which we actually find third declension endings. The word means true. It's related to the word aletheia that we've already learned, and so this is no surprise. Alethes, true, and we'll be finding this, of course, frequently, not only in the exercises but in the New Testament, so that's one word to get in mind. We'll look at the way in which this declension works out a little bit later, so just make a note of it at this point. Next word we have is the word aner, and Machen provides for you the genitive as well, andros. We'll be looking at that in just a moment. But aner is the word that means man. Of course, you've already learned the word anthropos, which means man. But as Machen notes here in the vocabulary list, the word anthropos in Greek really is a word that stands for man in the sense of humanity. I realize that contemporary language, we tend to avoid what is so-called sexist language, and I'm not going to worry about that too much right now, but in the Greek language there was a difference between being a man in the terms of human and being a man in the sense of male, and so this is the word for man, more in the sense of male. Aner, we have words like android, if you watch Star Trek or something like that, and so other words that use this particular term. The word we have next is Archaea Roots, And you'll notice this somewhat interesting ending here. It's similar to this word over here, which is hierus. These words are related to each other. This means the high priest or chief priest. The word over here simply means priest. We've had the word heron, which means temple, so you'll notice immediately that there is, of course, a connection between these two words. Archaea means reader or a leader or chief. So Archaea Roots, the chief priest. Roots, a priest. We'll look at the declension of this later, but those are words that should be somewhat familiar to you based on your prior learning. Basileus is going to be declined in the same way. That ending there is going to give rise to a set of endings that we'll look at in a moment. We've had the word basileia, which means kingdom. Not surprisingly, the word basileus means king. Next, we have the word genos, and this word means a race or a kind. You should distinguish this from the word genea, which is also shows up in the New Testament, which means a generation. The words are related, but they're not the same thing. In the New Testament, the word genea, which is not provided by Machen, means a generation, and usually there's a time frame involved, a generation in the sense that Jesus will sometimes speak of this generation. For example, this generation will not pass away. Well, that usually applies to a time frame, that is to say, a generation of the human race, whereas genos, a related word, means more a kind, a genus, a race, that sort of thing, with more of a timeless aspect to it. Related words, but not the same thing. Grammatus means scribe. Again, this ending that you recognize we've already seen here. It will be declined, by the way, the same way that these two words are. Grammatus is a scribe. Of course, we've had related words. For example, the word for scripture, and even the word for I write, grapho, is related to this root. Ethnos is the word that means a nation, and in the plural, ethne, it means the Gentiles. So this, of course, is a word that's frequently found in the New Testament. Jesus says, make disciples of the nations, the ethne. So that word shows up there. We've looked at hierus already. Mater, of course, mother. We know the term maternal, which of course comes straight from this Greek word. The next word, oros. Oros means a mountain. It's a neuter noun, and again, it's going to be declined in the same way as genos. So these two words have a distinct declension. We'll be looking at that in a moment. Next word we have is pater, masculine. This again is declined the same way as mater. We're going to look at that a little bit later. Of course, you know the word paternal, which comes from this Greek word, and it refers to things fatherly, as opposed to maternal, which refers to things motherly. So those two words, of course, should be pretty easy to remember. Pistis is a feminine noun, third declension. It means faith. We've had pistos, which means faithful, and so this should be no surprise. And this is a word, of course, that shows up innumerable times in the New Testament, so be sure to get that one under control. Plairace, again, is an adjective. We looked earlier at alethes, which means true. Plairace means full. You may have heard in your experience in Christian vocabulary the word pleroma, which also has to do with fullness. It's a noun. Plairace is a related word. It means full, and usually means full almost in the sense of overflowing. The next word we have is polis, which means city. Of course, you know the word politics comes from this. Carice is a word that means grace. We've had chara, which means joy. This is a related word, carice. So those are our vocabulary words. As you can probably tell just looking at them, these are words that, of course, are very important in the New Testament. They show up on many occasions, and so even though they are somewhat irregular in the way that they are declined, it's well worth your time and energy to master them, and so that's what we'll try to do as we proceed now. So now let's go ahead and take a look at some of these individual paradigms. The first word we're going to look at is the word carice. This word is actually the most similar of all of those that Machen gives you to the words that we learned back in chapter 17. So you see somewhat familiar endings here. We have carice, caritos, cariti, carin. The only exception really is that we would have expected this to be carita. Remember that? So if we were following the normal third declension endings that we had learned back in chapter 17, we'd have a different ending right here. That's what makes this somewhat irregular, and it's why Machen held off introducing it to you until now. Otherwise, it's pretty similar. Carice, you recall, caritone, Carice, and caritas. All of those are pretty much what we would have expected from back in chapter 17. So this is the one exceptional part. Otherwise, pretty easy to remember because it's similar to what you already learned. I'm just putting this word here to remind you that we've had the word joy, and this word is a related word. So this word for grace and joy, of course, not surprisingly, are connected ideas. The next word we want to look at is the word polis, and I've added here the word pistis, because what you're going to see is that these two words are declined the same way. And the way you notice that is if you look at the vocabulary list, you'll notice that the word polis continues with polios, and the word pistis continues with pisteos. And it's that ending in each case, which is similar, that tells you that those two words are going to be declined the same way. And so you don't look at the nominative singular to figure that out. You've got to see the genitive singular, and then that's going to be your clue as to how we'll proceed. So these two words are both declined the same way. What I'd like to do now is simply look at polis. Polis, the word for city, is declined as follows. We have polis, polios, and the thing you want to notice here, this violates, and it's the only violation of a rule that we learned way back in chapter 2. But you may remember that in chapter 2 we learned that if you have a long ultima, you cannot normally accent any syllable prior to the penult. But here you have one notable exception, the only exception, as Machen mentions, that he'll cover in this chapter. So we got polios here, and similarly polion here. The ending is what we'd expect in the genitive plural, not quite so much in the genitive singular, but the real notable aspect is that we do have a violation of that rule of accent that we learned way back at the beginning. So it's polis, polios, pole. Machen tells you the rationale behind these endings. There's a contraction that's going on here. I'm not going to bother with that really. If you want to look at that, I think it may be helpful, but for my money, I think the best way to learn this is just memorize it. Just memorize the genitive or the nominative and genitive, and then let that thought remind you that this is the way that you're going to decline these particular words. In the accusative, we have Pauline, and then in the vocative, Poli. Over here, of course, in the plural side, Polis, the accusative, the nominative plural. Here we have Polion, the genitive, policy, very similar, of course, to our English word policy, and indeed our word policy comes directly from that word, having to do with, you see, the city. And then finally, polis, the accusative, which is identical to the nominative. So those are the endings that we're going to use for those two words, polis and pistis. Both of these will be declined this way. The next word we want to look at here is Ghettos. We mentioned this before. It means a race or a kind. It's neuter. Two other words in this vocabulary list are declined the same way. Ethnos, which means nation, and oros, which means mountain. So what I'm going to give you here in connection with Ghettos would apply equally to these words as well. And there's actually a little less to this. You'll notice we have Genos, Genus, Gene. So the nominative, genitive singular, which actually looks a little bit like the accusative plural of the second declension, but this actually is the third declension, genitive singular, Genos, Genus, Gene, and then Gene, pronounced the same way, but actually this is the nominative plural, Gene, Genon, accent on the ultima here, which is Rule 51. It applies here, but not always in the third declension. And then finally, Genesi. Genesi. And so those words, this is the dative plural, of course. All of those words that I just mentioned will be declined this way. A little easier. There's not as many endings to learn. And so those are important words, and be sure you get those mastered. And so now we come to the word basileus, which means king. And we notice, of course, that in this vocabulary list we do have several other words that are declined the same way. Arus, Archaea Roots, basileus, grammatus. All of these, notice, are accented on the ultima, which is always the case with these kinds of words, and the declension of each of them will be identical. And so these are all words that you want to learn, and again you can tell that these are fairly common words that are going to show up in the New Testament. So let's look at basileus. All right, so here's our declension. It's basileus, basileos, basile. There's a contraction that happens here, but if you just learn it, I think that's the easiest way to deal with it. The accusative singular, basilea, and finally basileu. These are all, by the way, masculine. I think I should have mentioned that earlier. All of these nouns in the New Testament that have this ending are masculine nouns. Come to the nominative plural, and we have basileis, basileon, basileusi, and basileis. These, of course, are identical. So we have the nominative and accusative. They're identical. And actually, these two, the genitive and the dative plural, are somewhat familiar from the endings that you have there. So anyway, a little different from the other endings we've learned. This is a third declension noun that has its own set of endings. And again, there's quite a few other words in the New Testament that follow this paradigm. So again, you want to get these mastered. Now we come to the words that we mentioned earlier. Pater, which is the word for father. Aner, the word for man in the masculine sense. And mater, the word for mother. These are all declined the same way. Well, they're roughly declined the same way. Aner has a little bit of a exceptional aspect to it. You can look at the back of the book, as Machen suggests, but basically these are all declined the same way. So let's take a look at pater. The declension for pater is as follows: pater, and then the genitive patros, somewhat similar to third declension nouns that we learned in chapter 17. Similarly, patri in the dative singular, and then patera, patera. And so that's the singular side. Pateres, that's a common third declension ending. Pateron, similarly here, the ending is not surprising. Patrasi is the dative plural, and then finally pateras. So notice that in this case the accusative and the nominative are not the same, and this does follow more of the conventional third declension endings. And so these words, quite important, needs to be memorized as well. And finally, we want to take a look at these two adjectives. We have aletheis and pleires. And again, these two are going to be declined similarly. So here we have them: aletheis, alethus, alethe, alethe, alethes. I think it's actually preferable when you're memorizing these to memorize them across. So I would memorize them. This is the masculine and the feminine. Then the neuter is over here. Aletheis, alethes, alethus, alethus, alethe, 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 alethes, 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 you see. If you just kind of learn to recite it in your mind, you'll be able to retrieve it later when you need it. On the plural side, again, this is the masculine and feminine, the neuter. Over here, aletheis, alethe, alethon, alethon, alethesi, alethesi, alethes, alethe. It does have kind of a nice rhythm to it, and I think if you just recite it in your mind a couple of times, it'll probably stick there pretty well. So those are the two adjectives that we have that are declined in the third declension, and you'll want to be sure to get those worked out as well. Well, that brings us then to our exercises. So let's go ahead and take a look at these as we typically do. The first of the exercises provided by Machen: alethe esti ta lalumina hupo tu hiereos tutu. Well, what do we make of this? We know this word alethe means true, and I notice that it has the alethe ending there. And even though this is something you'll have to just memorize, if you have memorized it, then you'll notice that that alethe ending is actually associated with the neuter plural. And so I know that something in this sentence is going to be a neuter plural word that will go with that particular adjective. The singular verb here, of course, goes back to that rule that says a neuter plural subject can take a singular verb, and so that's what's going on. So true is or true are is going to be the case because aletheia is plural. And then here we have, of course, the plural word that's going to be associated. It happens to be a passive participle, present participle, so it's ta la lumina, the being spoken things, literally. So true are the being spoken things, hupo, by, takes the genitive, to, hiereos, the priest, to this one. So true are the things being spoken by this priest. So hopefully that's pretty straightforward. The only thing that's really new in this are the new vocabulary words that you're running into here. Otherwise, this is all going to be review. Let's take a look at this next exercise, number 2. Sunelthonton, ton, archaeareon, kai grammateon, hina apaktenosi, ton andra, tutu, pros euxanto, hoi mathetai in to hero. Well, what can we work out of this one? First of all, I detect this genitive and immediately suspect that what I'm dealing with is going to be a genitive absolute, given that we have this genitive participle here. So sunelthonton, second aorist with the present ending. So having, then sunerchomai, come together. So having come together, ton archaeareon, kai grammateon, in the genitive plural, of course, the chief priests and scribes. So far we have the chief priests and scribes having come together. Hina, in order that, takes the subjunctive, apaktenosi. This is the third person plural ending with the subjunctive there. Has the aorist stem, liquid verb with an aorist stem there. So it's in order that they might kill, ton andra, this is the accusative singular, the man, tuton, this one, or this man. Pros euxanto, this of course from prosukomai, to pray, is a deponent verb. It's aorist, I see the sign of the aorist there, and also the augment here. Third person plural ending in the aorist middle, so it's going to be carrying out the deponent aspect of it. They prayed, in other words, pros euxanto, hoi mathetai, the disciples prayed in to hero, in the temple. So after the chief priests and scribes had come together in order that they might kill this man, the disciples prayed in the temple. And finally, the third of the exercises, the translation exercises, apokrythe, hobasilus, hoagathos, legon, hoti, tu, thele, apoktenai, tuton. So, what do we have? Apokrythe, this is, of course, an aorist passive form here, but we know it comes from apokrynomai, which means answer, and it is deponent. So this is the deponent in the aorist passive form, but active meaning. And so it's going to be the third person singular, ho basilus, the king answered. And then we have the modification of the king, the good one, or the good king answered, legon, present participle in the nominative, singular masculine. The good king answered saying, hoti, that, u thele, he does not wish. But remember, we calibrate the indirect discourse according to the time of the leading verb. And so the word is going to be calibrated according to apokrythe, which of course is aorist. So the good king answered saying that he did not wish. We're going to put thele in the past tense on that basis as indirect discourse here. He did not wish, apoktenai, to kill. This is, of course, an aorist infinitive. We have the lengthened stem, which tells us that it's aorist, a liquid verb here. He did not wish to kill tuton, this man. So the good king answered saying that he did not wish to kill this man. All right, let's take a look at the composition exercises. The first of them reads, I'm reading from Machen's text now, "This is the race that killed those who believe on Jesus." So this is, tuto is the race. We know that genos is neuter, so I'm going to use the neuter demonstrative pronoun. This is an enclitic, of course, so we accent the ultima of the preceding word according to the rules of enclitic accent. So tuto este, this is, and the to genos, the race, the kind could be as well, but here, of course, Machen gave us the word race, the race. This is, by the way, in the nominative because esti takes the predicate nominative, so this is the race. And now we have to apektenon. This is a participle. It needs to agree with to genos, which happens to be neuter, nominative, singular, and so we have the neuter, nominative, singular ending on this second aorist stem, apektenon. That's why the accent is on the final syllable, because you recall that we have in the second aorist participle an irregular accent, and the accent winds up on the ultima. And so this is the race, the killed, tous pistuantos. Notice that that verb was in the present participle. The believing, this is accusative, plural, masculine. This is the race that killed the believing in Jesus ones, and so those who believe in Jesus. So roughly translated, this is the race that killed those who believe in Jesus. Second exercise, when the scribes had entered into that city, the disciples went away to the mountains. I can do this either using the infinitive. You may recall the articular infinitive, although here I'm going to start out using the aorist participle instead. And so the scribes, this is a genitive absolute, you recall. When the scribes had entered that city, the disciples went away. So this genitive absolute phrase is going to be independent of the rest of it, and we indicate that with the genitive terms here. So the scribes in the genitive, aselphonton, irregular accent on a second aorist participle. Again, you'll notice it's the genitive, plural, masculine, the scribes having entered, ace, akenentain, polin, into that city. And polin here in the accusative singular has that ending. So the scribes having entered into that city, and then the rest of the sentence, hoi mathetai, the disciples, apelthon, from aperkamai, went away, second aorist. Second aorist is accented irregularly, of course, here, so we have it on the, what would amount to the augment. So the disciples went away, pros ta ore, into the mountains. Remember that this ending goes with the words that are neuter in this third declension setting, like oros or genos, as we've noted, or ethnos, and this is the plural, both in the nominative and in the accusative. And so that's why we have that ending. So pros ta ore, to the mountains. So the scribes, having entered into that city, the disciples went away to the mountains. And by the way, if you did want to use the articular infinitive, then of course it would simply be mata after to, the active, aselphein. Remember that the second aorist infinitive uses the present infinitive ending, but the accent goes on the ultima, so that's why we have it accented there. So after the act of entering, and then remember the subject of an infinitive is in the accusative. So instead of ton grammateon, it's going to be tous grammates, you recall, and then the rest of the sentence remains the same. And the last sentence we have from Machen, we saw that the word which was being spoken by the man was true. All right, pretty straightforward. We saw, second aorist, edomen, we saw hoti, that, to rhema, I chose to use this word rhema instead of logos, just nice to mix it up a little bit. We saw that the word the being spoken, and so this is going to be a nominative, neuter, singular, the word, the being spoken one, present participle. So that would be the ending, hupo to anthropu, by the man. And I could have used, of course, the word andros here instead. You can go either way. I suppose Machen would have preferred we use the word andros, but I chose to use anthropu instead, by the man. Ein, this is the first or the third person singular verb of being in the imperfect, so the word spoken by the man, ein, was aletheis, true. Remember, that's the neuter ending, and it's going to be in the nominative, and so because it's going with the word which was spoken here, which is a neuter in the nominative case. So we saw that the word that was being spoken by the man was true. So I think you see that the main challenge in this chapter is going to be learning these new endings that go with various classes of nouns associated with the third declension. It can feel like a, death by 1,000 paper cuts here, but I think if you just spend a little time working on it, you'll find it's not that difficult, and that there is a kind of logic to each of these words as you work out the particulars of each of the endings. So anyway, that's the bulk of it for this chapter. Again, I want you to go ahead and go through the exercises and make sure that you've figured out where all the problems are, if you have any problems as you're doing them. And as soon as you're comfortable with this chapter, then we'll meet back here next time for chapter 26. Until then, God richly bless your studies of the Greek language. We'll see you next time.